course, that was the big bonanza with the boats every year. That was the icing on the cake, really, for the year. So we went to Dunmore East and fished there the winter. And we used to run across to Milford Haven if the market was better over there. And it was on one of those runs over to Milford Haven that I first had a view of the big super tankers into the big oil terminal there in Milford Haven. And I thought, yes, I think deep sea is the thing for me. I want a bit of that. But worked on with Jerry anyway, and in the summer of 1965 we were working down off the old head at Kilkeel, and we heaving up the gear, but we noticed that the gear was a bit lopsided. We knew we had something heavy on one side of it, and when we hauled the gear up, there was this large round steel protrusion just bobbed above the surface. So of course all hands thought we had picked up a torpedo, and everybody ran off to get around the back of the wheelhouse. Now, what good it was going to do in a 90-foot boat, like, you know, if it had been a torpedo, we would have been fish bait along the splinters, but it seemed the only thing to do at the time. But we gathered up courage to come around anyway to discover that it wasn't a torpedo at all. It was a lifeboat davit of the Lusitania. And here in the photograph you can see it. And I had lost track of it. The Cork Examiner had come out that day and asked us if we would leave it in Kilkeel. And Jerry said no, he would take it on home, which he did. But I had lost track of where it had went to, and there was a guy on radio also one morning with Jerry Anderson, North Mercy on him, and he was talking about the old steamships and all of that. And I just put in the query about, you know, picking up the lifeboat davit of the Lusitania. So the man said, well, where do you live? I said, Warren Point. Well, he says, it's not very far from you. He says, it's in a little park, he says, in Donal. I didn't even know it was there. So, and I'm sure there are an awful lot of people possibly here tonight that seen it in the park but didn't know what it was either. Well, that's what it is. But as I say, this was 1965. In 1960, I left Jerry then, as I said, with a view to go deep sea. But before I went down to Belfast, where you had to go down and sign on the pool and be designated the ship then that you were an ordinary seaman looking for a ship. The shipping strike came in May 1966, and of course that put paid to that idea, because all of the ships were then tied up and there was no movement at all. So I thought, well, you know, I'm not fishing, I'm not going deep sea. But I had met in the early years when I was fishing with Jerry a young man called Donal McAlinden. And he fished with his father on the Castle Bay. And he was leaving the Castle Bay to go and do his mate's ticket, which was known then as the second-hand special. And he knew I was off. He came up and says, will you fill in for me for a couple of weeks? He says, we're going to run carpets for Sir Lord from Donal to Port Patrick. I said, I will, surely. I wasn't doing anything, so we started to run carpets. The new Castle Bay, this one here, had come in, and we started to run carpets from Donal to Port Patrick. We were about 3 weeks of that when we also had a contract to fill in to run fish from Lerwick in Shetland down to the northeast of Scotland to Fraserburgh, because there was a big herring fishery in Shetland, but there were only small drifters that were working that time, and the buyers were all south. So the ferry would only take about 35, 40 ton or something like that, so it wasn't enough. So the big companies then in Fraserburgh hired boats to run fish from Shetland down to the northeast. It was a 16-hour run, and the Castle Bay was one of those boats. So we had an absolute ball. We were all young. It was the middle of the summer. We were getting paid even if we didn't work. So what better, you couldn't get any better than that. So we worked the whole summer then at that, and then whenever the herring fishery finished, we then went back to fishing ourselves. And that was in 1966. We worked on the same thing. We fished very well with the Castle Bay, and worked right through until in 1968 the first Quo Vadis arrived. Now this was a completely new set of circumstances altogether. It was a huge investment for Donnan. There's Rick Donnan, there's a photograph of him there with his wife Betty and Frank, that's in here. And that was sitting in the cabin of the first Quo Vadis whenever she was launched in the yard in Monica Dam in Holland. Now, she was only 100 feet, but she was purpose-built to purse net, which was a new method for the whole of the Scottish, Irish fishing fleet. There were some of them making sort of inroads into it and that by trying to convert older boats from ring netters, from sea netters to purses and that, and they weren't big enough. They could only use small, or they only had room for small nets. So the Quo Vadis was, as I say, £100,000 at that time. Like, you're talking somewhere in the region, probably about 1.5 million. So like in 1968, that was a huge investment for something really that hadn't been tried. And of course, we were completely new to it as well. But there were, we had taken on 3 Norwegians as well to show us how the system worked. And there was also a small boat. There were 2 different systems. One was the Norwegian one, where they had what they called a dory. The Norwegians had the theory that the big sonar for finding the fish also frightened the fish. So when they would find the fish at a distance, then the big boat stopped, launched the small boat. There was a sonar in it as well, and it went then and it positioned over the radio, told the big boat where the fish were exactly lying. It could lie over the top of them because the small boat had a guard over its propeller. So the big boat then shot the net round the small boat, and that was sort of the way they started to close the purse net then from the bottom with the wire. The small boat then had another purpose, because normally the Norwegians didn't have side propellers. So the small boat was also used as a tugboat. They had a wire which ran from forward to aft. And nobody had, the man in the small boat, all he had to do was to come up, hook in his tow rope, and whatever way the skipper directed him from the big boat, he could either move forward on the wire or move aft. So he was able to pull the boat whatever way it needed to be pulled. The Quo Vadis came, the Quo Vadis had side thrusters, a completely new innovation. But we were working the small boat just the same because of finding fish. But early on we noticed that when we were working with the Norwegians, the Icelanders were also working there. They didn't use a small boat. They just used the big boat to shoot the net. Bingo. It was faster, it was more efficient, and all the Icelanders had to do was watch the Norwegians launching the small boat. And that was the same as putting up a flag, the fish is here. So the Icelanders just come up and they just shot around the fish. So the Norwegians lost out on that. So Donal and Frank realised earlier on that The Icelandic system was the best. Now, this worked very well. In 1969, we were fishing away, doing bits and pieces. 1969, this is the original crew in 1968. In 1969, the Queen visited Shetland in the Royal Yacht. And that was, you know, a big thing in Shetland as well. But where are we? Oh. There were many stories, many things that happened when, with the first Quo Vadis. There were some occasions when the small boat didn't actually make it to the fish. It got capsized on some occasions. Because sometimes when you were launched now, when it went down over the side, Frank lost sight of it in the wheelhouse. So he thought it was gone, so he just opened the throttle and threw the helm over. And of course, he couldn't see that the boat was still attached to the derrick. So you slacked out as much wire as you could so that you could get it hooked off till it ran to the dog on the end of the barrel. And then by that time, the small boat had turned around sideways, dipped her rail and flipped her. And I remember on one occasion this happening anyway, and of course it pulled the dog out of the barrel of the winch. The wire went flying out through the blocks. So everything was upside, the boat was upside down, the wire was hanging vertically underneath it, we could do nothing. So, of course, there was no sign of Donal. He was under the boat. So when we eventually got back anyway, got Frank said, you know, come back, you know, the boat's capsized and that, and of course, didn't seem funny at the time, but Donal, or Frank was in an awful panic, like, you know, whenever he eventually seen Donal clamber back up, and there he is sitting with a leg on either side of the blades. And Frank shouts over to him, "Are you alright, my son?" And he says, "When I get back aboard that boat, I'll let you know whether I'm alright or not." But, you know, there were many occasions that things just didn't go right, but it was a wonderful way of fishing, and it was a deadly way of fishing. And unfortunately, the first Quo Vadis in 1970, it was a husky day, cargo shifted, and she pretty much just, well, the crew knew she was going, got the life raft onto her deck, and there was no loss of life. Everybody got off from that, you know. And the only man, they were left with nothing, only what they were standing up in. And the only man that had anything other than that was Seamus Higgins. And Seamus had his wallet in his arse pocket. Seamus never went anywhere without his, you know, without his wallet. Seamus, Lord of mercy, has now left us, but, you know, if any of you get to the big fishing grounds and up there, if you see a wee angel with, you know, short fat legs, you know, and a wallet in his arse pocket, you know, that's Higgins. But as I said, boat was lost, so all hands were unemployed again. Some of us went back to fishing all the boats. Some of us went back to walking ashore. Donal, he went to Iceland because he thought he liked the way the Icelanders used the purse net, shot the purse net solely with the sonar. So he spent the next period of time while the second Quo Vadis was being built. And as I say, worked with Icelanders, but I've seen an awful lot of really how it shouldn't be done, because it was very labour intensive the way that they were boxing fish and all the rest. But before he went there was a boat that Christian Salveson's brought in, a boat called the Semla. And the Semla was an innovation too, because she had her fish in tanks. She had refrigerated seawater, and she pumped her fish aboard, same as the Quo Vadis, first Quo Vadis. But she also tried to pump them out, and the quality suffered because of it. So the second Quo Vadis then was built, right, she was going to have tanks. 6 tanks, there would be no boxing or anything out. We pumped the fish aboard and we brailed it out. Which, that, whenever she came and that, she came as what they called CSW system, which was chilled water system, which was, you put ice in the tanks and then you put fish in. Now, when we were coming home from the yard in Norway, which was built, stopped at Aberdeen, and we put 20 ton into each of 3 tanks. We came on home, fine. People came to visit the boat and all the rest, was fine. Then we went back. There was a small herring fishery in the Clyde. So we up to the Clyde anyway, shot our net, got herring, pumped our herring aboard, brilliant. Filled our tanks, knew there was ice and all, great job. Came into air to land them, lifted the lids off our tanks, and what did we see? 3 whopping great big icebergs. Because the ice had went solid, and of course ice been lighter than water. When we pumped the tanks full, up the ice came to the top, all the fish were on the bottom. So we had 20 ton of ice in each tank to try and get through, to get it broke up before we get the fish out. When we did, of course, the fish were still alive. So this was unheard of. You know, the buyers they just thought this was, it was in all the papers and there. This was the way that fishing should be done. So we worked that year anyway, but we learned our lesson with the ice. And as we were landing practically every day, we didn't bother with the ice. We had a very successful year, then went back the next year. No, 70, she came in 72. In 73, we were working up off the west coast of Lewis, an island called Scalpay. We were just after hauling our gear. Daylight had just broken, and we suffered a terrible tragedy when one of our crew, Jimmy Carr, seen here on the left, went out over our stern. We were steaming about half speed. Jimmy couldn't swim. He had all his gear on him. The water was exceptionally cold, and he would have went straight into the wash of the blades, which would have turned him over like he was in a washing machine. Jimmy never came to the surface. We had to come home and have a wake with his parents and that, and no remains. That was 41 years ago. Jimmy would be 70 years of age, 71 today. But that was a terrible tragedy and had an awful effect on us all. It was bad enough losing a man, but to come home and not even have a remains for the family. You know, that we were just torn apart over that. But gathered ourselves together, and we had men to feed and wages to make and a boat to pay for, so we went back to sea and continued to fish extremely well. Quo Vadis 2 broke all sorts of records. She was the biggest purser in Britain, and there were no quotas or anything at that stage, and we could land wherever we wished. So the markets were good. The quality of the fish that we landed, because it was tanks, was good. Brilliant. And as I say there, this 1 week there, she made 59,000. Now £59,000 then is the equivalent of 700,000 today. So like that, for 1 week's landing, she cost 200,000 to build, and she made 59,000 in 1 week. So it'll give you some idea of how successful she was. But it was at an ideal time as well in the fishing, because to say, there was no restrictions on sort of what you could catch, where you could catch it, or where you could land it. We would have caught fish in the west coast of Scotland, and we ran to Skegness in Holland, or we ran down to Hertsels in Denmark, or Skagen, or we ran across to Norway as well. So having tanks and keeping fish in good quality, wasn't a problem. As I say, in 1974, she went back to Norway again, and we changed the system from chilled seawater to RSW, refrigerated seawater. Put in a huge big refrigeration plant so that we could take the water from the top of the tanks, put it through our cooling system, and pump it back in the bottom again and keep it circulating. So it left us that we could land fish, keep fish aboard and land after nearly 4 days, and the fish was in perfect condition. So that was, we then, the fishing started, the mackerel fishery then started to wean a bit on in the North Atlantic, the North Sea, and another thing arose that Donnan, who was a big financer with the McAlinden family, was bought over by Salvesons, and they knew he was, you know, such an entrepreneurial character that they thought, we can't let this guy start up again in opposition to us. So they more or less told him, as part of the selling agreement, they would draw a line between Fleetwood and the Humber. So he was not allowed to do anything north of that. But we also knew that there was a mackerel fishery in the southwest, down off Plymouth, right down to Land's End. So Donal had been doing a wee bit of groundwork on that, went down, and Millbay Docks in Plymouth was derelict. There was a huge big pier, all of the warehouses, and it was lying derelict. So Donnan took a lease on the pier and all of the warehouses in Millbay Dock. And then we started to move down. The Quo Vadis was the kingpin in the whole operation. We moved down to the mackerel fishery in Plymouth. The local fishery, they were all hand liners, and they landed their fish and counted their catch by the stone. So the next thing, here comes the biggest purser in the British Isles, slap bang into the middle of the fishing grounds, and where they were landing stones in the day, we were landing upwards of 300 tonne a day. The first night that we shot net down there, we carried 2 nets, a small net for the shallow water and a deep net. Shot the small one, and all we got back was ribbons. The marks of mackerel were that big. Tried to take a little corner off them and blew everything asunder. But, you know, we very quickly learned that, you know, all you want is a wee piece the size of a match head of something the size of this room, because the shoals were just dense, and they were great big mackerel. They were huge big mackerel. And we, as I say, learned to that, and then at first we didn't have a market set up. So a lot of it went, unfortunately, to fish meal. But very quickly, Donnan got the market set up, mostly on the French side, because the Roscoff ferry, running from Roscoff to Plymouth, come into Millbay Docks. So the trucks could come off the ferry and never even have to go out through the dock gates. Come round the docks, come round to Millbay Dock, we loaded them, and they were back on the ferry when it sailed again at 11 o'clock. And we had it down to the fine art that the ferry berthed at 7 o'clock in the morning, and 4 hours later we could have had 10 lorries going back on the ferry and fully loaded. So, you know, again, the whole system worked very well. The local ice plant and all around the Barbican and Plymouth couldn't supply enough ice. So Donal then, we'll build our own ice plant. But you don't have three-phase power. I'll put in my own generator. And that's what he done. So we were completely self-sufficient, you know, for all of the things that we needed. And it was extremely successful. So successful that they were then made in 1977, 78. Donnan and Frank were made an offer that they couldn't refuse to sell the Quo Vadis. So she was sold. As I say, she was built for 200,000. She was sold for 750 6 years later. The following year, we had no boat, so we chartered one out of Iceland called the Thor's Hammer. And we fished her for the next season in Plymouth until the third Quo Vadis was built. The Thor's Hammer was a story as well. A couple of the Iceland crew stayed with us. Now, they had absolutely no English whenever they arrived, and it was what they learned when they were going back was colourful, let's say. But they stayed with us anyway, and of course the money was very, very good with them. And when the season was over, the boat then had to be taken and put up on the slip to have her bottom surveyed again before she could be handed back. And we went into Fleetwood, went up on the slip, and of course then the next thing there was a strike called on the slip. So they said, well, why are you striking, you know? Well, the heating's not working. Well, what's that got to do with you out in the slip, you know? Oh, same union. Well, anyway. But it gave the Icelanders a chance anyway to go up the street in Fleetwood. And they just couldn't believe the price of the TVs and the washing machines and the tumble dryers and all of the rest. So when she come down off the slip, the lorries started to arrive. And they loaded washing machines and TVs, you name it, into the fish tanks. So she went back to Iceland with a full cargo of electronics from Fleetwood. The next year then, the third Quo Vadis came. EU regulations were coming in, and with the possible restriction on the length of build. So the Quo Vadis 3 was built at 90 feet overall, but she was built with an awful lot more beam than a 90-foot boat would normally have. So the photograph here you see was taken by an RAF helicopter. We were running down from the west coast down to Holyhead. She's only 90 feet. We have 150 ton on board here, and an RAF helicopter came out from Valley and took photographs of her and called us up on 16 to ask us were we all right. So we said yes, this was quite normal. So he went away, and then he came back and he took another photograph. So we didn't know that he had photographed us until the photographs arrived in the office in Plymouth. And this is one of the photographs that he took. But the following year then, she went back and she was lengthened. In fact, she was lengthened twice. And this is how she finished up. She went from 90 feet to 127 feet, and her capacity went from 150 to 350 ton. Her wheelhouse was lifted, her derrick and mast was taken away, it was fitted with a crane, and that was, again, she continued to be very successful, and that brought her right up to 1990 when this is her the slip and the dry dock in Dublin. But in 1990 then, in July time, we were starting back then. Again, we had a small fishery at the Isle of Man, and we ran into the point in that, and most of our fish then, we worked along with the Spes Magna and the Stevens, Bobby and Sam McCullough. And as I say, this was a sort of a shakedown cruise before the heavy stuff started up north again. And anything that was going to go wrong, we needed it to go wrong before we went north. But unfortunately, in my situation, things did go wrong. A piece of equipment fell on top of me when we were landing in one point, and that, I'm afraid, finished my career at the fishing. So, the Quo Vadis then, they continued to fish that season, and Donal retired then, sold her the following year, and retired from the fishing as well. So from all that's her in her Norwegian colours with a Norwegian registration. They kept the name, still kept Quo Vadis, but I think she was eventually then scrapped. So I don't think that, maybe the name has been retained somewhere else, I don't know. But that's the last photographs that we have of her. And as I said, it was over the 20 years that it was, from me joining the McAlindens until leaving, you know, it was an experience, and obviously a very profitable one as well, because there were, you know, both Frank and Donal, they were great fishermen, they had great vision, and it was a very successful 20 years. And I think it's something really that Kilkeel should be very proud of, really, that sort of success was realised here. So, ladies and gentlemen, that about finishes. You know, I hope you have enjoyed what I have said, and I hope you have found it interesting. There's still, you know, those of you who haven't read the bits and pieces and that, you know, feel free to walk around and view. Thank you very much.